Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dean Singleton, Chairman and Publisher of the Denver Post and your moderator for the evening.
Thank you. First off, the four gentlemen who just left, I wonder, where were they on September the 11th, 2001? I mean, I know. Well, actually, there's one still here. Where the hell were you on September the 11th, 2001? I know where I was, and I know where 3,000 people were. And that's why we're here. So if there's any more of you out there, would you please stand up and get it out of your system? Who the hell can forget September the 11th, 2001? Anyway, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that excellent overview. I look forward to hearing more from you on a variety of issues as we move forward this evening. And I want to thank Cliff May for his participation here with us this evening, and I want to ask him about an issue that he knows well to begin the dialogue. Tensions have been rising between Iran and the West over Tehran's nuclear energy program, which Iran says is peaceful and Western nations say is a cover for efforts to construct a nuclear weapon. In recent weeks, the U.S. has moved significant military reinforcements to the Persian Gulf in order to deter Iran from shutting the Strait of Hormuz and to have forces in place should the standoff over Iran's nuclear program escalate. Mr. May, in your opinion, how will Iran respond to a buildup of U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf? And do you think there's still time for sanctions to work, or is it futile to think that Iran will curb its nuclear ambitions?
Wow. Thank you, Dean. There's a lot to unpack here. Let me try to do it very briefly. First thing I think it's important to say is there's really no debate among reasonable people over whether or not Iran is building a nuclear weapons capability or whether it's building nuclear energy facilities. You don't build nuclear energy facilities deep inside of mountains. You don't go through what they're going through right now in terms of the sanctions in order to have that. If all they wanted was nuclear energy, and don't forget this is one of the countries in the world that has the most oil and natural gas of anywhere, so they don't need it, there would be no problem. We could figure that out, we could work that out, we could have inspections, we could have verification. They could have that if they wanted to. They're building nuclear weapons, that's their goal, and they've been very specific about what they want to use those weapons for. As for the buildup, the U.S. buildup in the Straits of Hormuz and in that area, which is where a great deal of the world's oil goes, the rational calculation from the Iranian point of view would be to do nothing about what the U.S. is doing there. Because if they should attack U.S. forces, the likelihood is very great that this president or any president will very rapidly use our forces in that area to destroy their air defenses, to destroy the military capabilities they have, to do them really very serious damage. So a rational calculation would say they will not do that. But you can't always count on a rational calculation. And the reason why is because there's a very specific ideology that the Iranian regime has. I don't think most of the people of Iran share it. It goes back to the revolution of 1979. In 1979, I was a young foreign correspondent, and I covered that revolution. And I could talk to you for a very long time about the ideology, but I'll give you just what was my first awakening as to it. I was in the holy city of Qom with my producer. I was working on a documentary for Bill Moyer's television show on public TV. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, we were there to see, at least view the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of this revolution. And my Iranian producer, who I would say was a true believer, turned to me and he said, "You're so lucky." And I said, not quite understanding what he meant, I said, "You're right, I am. I'm a young foreign correspondent, and I'm sitting with a front row seat on history. This is very lucky. You're right." And he said, "No, you don't understand, do you? You don't understand. You are lucky because there have only been a few really great men in history. There was Moses, and there was Jesus, and there was Mohammed, and now there is Khomeini, and you are in his glorious presence." Now, this is the ideology you have to begin to understand. You have to understand the ambitions that they have. This revolution was not simply about overthrowing the Shah. It was about overthrowing the West, the Zionist Crusader Empire, as they would call it. It is about much, much more. This is the most dangerous regime in the world in this century, and it's very important we recognize it for what it is.
Secretary Chertoff, do you agree with Cliff's assessment? And if so, what do you think the U.S. will do and when?
Well, I agree that I think it's very hard to assume that an Iranian regime with a nuclear weapon would be subject to the kind of deterrence that we had during the Cold War. Not only because I think the ideological framework and the premises with which they operate are different, but also because I think the opportunity for them to miscalculate what we would do is very high. I think if the regime itself began to feel imperiled by popular discontent, they might decide to use nuclear weapons as a way of shifting attention. I think, frankly, they look at what happened in Libya, and they said, wow, if Gaddafi had kept his nuclear weapons, he'd still be the dictator of Libya, and that enters into their mind. So I think you cannot count on deterrence. You cannot afford to let them have a weapon. Now, will sanctions work? Only recently have we really turned up the sanctions to where there may be a real impact. And I think we'll have to watch and give a little bit of time to see if that works. But I think it would be a big mistake to rely only on sanctions. I think there are a variety of tools that could be used, some of them perhaps secret, some of them perhaps not so secret, that we have to be prepared to deploy in order to prevent this regime from actually getting operational nuclear weapons.
Mr. Secretary, what do you think the role of the Department of Homeland Security is in supporting the U.S. efforts to contain Iran?
I think when you look at any national security issue, it's no single department. It's one of the things I learned from my 4 years is it's really a team approach. Everybody has to be working together. Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, the FBI, state and locals. Everybody plays a different position, but in the end, it has to be coordinated. If, in fact, we got into a circumstance with Iran where it looked like it might move to the level of some form of aggressiveness, obviously the U.S. military would have the responsibility for what goes on overseas, although I do have to say that we have Coast Guard personnel in the region because the Coast Guard has some very particular capabilities. Now, Admiral Lloyd, who was my military advisor, knows this very well. So they would be in the region too. But Homeland Security would be concerned about what might the Iranians do here in the United States. And working with the Justice Department, the FBI, and other agencies and state and locals, we'd have to be looking at, does Hezbollah have operatives in the United States? Are there Iranian sympathizers? When we went into Iraq in 2003, there was a well-developed plan for making sure Iraqi agents did not decide to do things in the United States as a way of retaliating or deflecting attention. So I think what you've got to have is a comprehensive plan that looks at security, again, from the farthest area of the Straits of Hormuz down to our local communities.
We're aware of Iran's foiled plans to attack Saudi diplomats on U.S. soil. Is there anticipation of further Iranian terrorists in the U.S. in light of the current tensions? If you were still the Secretary of Homeland Security, what would you do to counter threats from Iran and from to our homeland? And in your opinion, is enough being done about that issue today?
Well, for those who may not have followed the story with a lot of detail, just a 1-minute summary of what happened. Earlier this year, I think it was, the FBI disclosed and uncovered a plot for some Iranian business folks who were trying to reach out to Mexican drug cartels to get them to plan to bomb in Washington to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States in a restaurant. Happens to be a restaurant I eat at from time to time, so I took a personal interest. Now, it turned out that the so-called drug cartel member that they dealt with was really an informant, and it's a great example of the FBI doing a terrific job. But what struck people was how extraordinary a plot it was. To actually kill the Saudi ambassador in the United States would be an unbelievably provocative act. And I think the first reaction many people had is, it's some crazy guy out on his own, kind of mission. But according to what was disclosed in court documents, the individuals, the Iranians in the US, had connections back to the Quds Force, which is the kind of operational military arm of the religious establishment in Iran. So that while perhaps you can't say that it went to the very top of the Iranian state, this was not just a rogue operation. This was sanctioned by officials in an organization that is at the very core of the regime. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the regime may be prepared to take steps that we would consider irrational and self-defeating, but which they may think are a way of pushing back on us or retaliating against us. And that's to Cliff's point about whether you can really believe they're going to behave rationally. The second thing it tells us is they already believe we're in a struggle with them. They think we are at war with them at some level, and therefore they're prepared to take steps that we would consider acts of war. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. The third thing is that domestic collection of information and intelligence will always be a key element of protecting ourselves against these kinds of plots.
Cliff, you got a point?
Yeah, I want to just make a point of that. The Iranians, this regime in Iran, has believed since 1979 that it's at war with us, and it's been fighting that war. In 1979, if you'll recall, they seized our embassy and held our diplomats hostage. That is an act of war. 4 years later, they dispatched Hezbollah, which Secretary Chertoff correctly said is their proxy overseas terrorist organization, to suicide bomb the Marine barracks in Beirut. More Marines were killed in Beirut in 1983 under Iran's orders than at any point since Iwo Jima. They have been killing Americans by design and facilitating their killing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, you can say it's not rational for them to try to blow up a restaurant in Washington, D.C., but they've paid no price for that, or for any of these other things. Or, as you mentioned, killing people in Argentina in 1994, killing Iranian expatriates in Europe on a number of occasions. I could go through a whole list. So they have been waging this war. That gets a little bit back to a question I didn't answer about sanctions. Sanctions, and my organization did a lot of research on sanctions at the request of Congress. Most of us do not believe we're going to persuade the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to change their mind about nuclear weapons through sanctions. But if you don't have sanctions, you're saying we're going to do business as usual while they are killing Americans and while they are doing all these things. There'll be no punishment for them as the leading sponsor of terrorism in the world. They have been for years, so acknowledged, designated by the State Department, the leading nuclear proliferator, inciter of genocide. All the things they're doing egregiously illegal, we're going to do nothing to them. Now, what sanctions could do is it could help spark another uprising like we saw in 2009 when the people, if you remember, took to the streets yelling, "Death to the dictators." They really would like to throw off this regime. But you can't plan for that. At the very least, by using economic sanctions, we will know at the end of the day that all peaceful means to dissuade this regime or stop this regime from having nuclear weapons will have been tried. And if other means become necessary, at least everything else was attempted.
Okay. The Obama administration has recently stated that all options are on the table to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. Cliff, what is the likelihood of Israel acting unilaterally against the Iranian nuclear program in the coming weeks or months? If Israel does decide to conduct a preemptive attack, would the U.S. support its efforts? What type of capabilities would Israel need to launch a successful operation against Iran, and how might Iran respond? That's a mouthful, but it's all one subject.
Let me see if I can do that in 10 seconds. First of all, I think what we can say with assurance is that Israel will not outsource its national security to anybody else, not to those who are friendly or those who are not. The state was set up as a refuge for Jews. They are going to do what they think is necessary. Now, in terms of what they are going to do, anybody who talks about it probably doesn't know. Anybody who knows doesn't talk about it. I think that you have to figure that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition government is looking at all the capabilities they have and deciding what to do and in what time frame to do it. And the one thing you can expect is that if and when they do something, it will not be what you expect them necessarily to do. Now, they are looking at, among other things, we know this, at cyber weapons as well. And the Secretary has rightly said that cyber terrorism is a great threat, but a cyber war is already taking place in the world. It is very important that the US and Israel and other free countries have cyber defenses and cyber offenses that are better than any of their enemies or adversaries. That is absolutely essential. If the Israelis, and the Israelis we believe, and I'm not telling tales out of school because this has been reported, maybe from leaks, but reported, the Israelis have been working closely with the US in some of these cyber capabilities, using US supercomputers and that sort of thing. And the Israelis have very well developed cyber capabilities. If they can use cyber capabilities, they will do so. But they will look at a range of things, and I think the expectation is that if they do something, you will say that's not exactly the way it was expected. I would hope that, first of all, I don't think Iran should be Israel's primary responsibility. It's the responsibility of the leader of the free world, because this is a regime that is fighting a war against all of us. Ali Larijani, who is the Speaker of the Majlis, the Parliament, said last week, very threateningly, it is time for the disappearance of America and Israel. He said both together. So we shouldn't outsource this problem either. If the Israelis do decide to act in their own self-defense against a regime that has threatened them with genocide, I would hope that the US would give strong backing to that.
But in your opinion, will Israel do a preemptive attack?
I think the Israelis will not allow this regime to get nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons capability if they can prevent that, and they will take considerable risks to achieve that.
And will the United States be right there with them?
I'm certainly hopeful that we will.
But will they?
I think Casey Stengel said, it's dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future.
Secretary.
He knows Yogi Berra.
That was Yogi Berra. I always get those confused.
Sorry.
Mr. Secretary, will Israel do a preemptive attack?
I don't think I can add to what Cliff said. I don't think anybody knows. I mean, they're going to have to judge the point at which they hit the level, the line of no return. And I think if they didn't believe that there was an alternative, I think they would do it. But we've yet to see what happens in Iran, both in terms of sanctions and in terms of internal dynamics. You know, who would have thought 6 months before what happened in Egypt in the spring of last year that Mubarak would wind up being on trial? So there are a lot of uncertainties, but you have to prepare for all the options.
Also last week, something happened you may not have seen, but it's important. There was an Iranian-conducted poll that showed, that 63% of Iranians are saying, we would like to get rid of this nuclear weapons program and get rid of the sanctions as well. It was up on an Iranian website very briefly before it was pulled down. And whoever put that up on the website, I don't think they're having as pleasant an evening tonight as we are. But a very clever journalist took screenshots of it, so we know it did exist. And so what we now know is that the apologists for the Tehran regime, who have said for years the people are foursquare in favor of this nuclear program, they have now been proven conclusively wrong based on a poll that the regime itself ordered.
And Mr. Secretary, when Israel does make that preemptive attack, will our country be with them?
I can't, I'd be speculating about it. The real issue, I think, in many ways is this. If the Israelis were to attack, would the Iranians regard that as something in which they would limit their response to Israel, or would engulf not only Israel but the United States and, frankly, the countries in the region? Don't forget the most immediate threat the Iranians pose is to the countries that are on the other side of the Persian Gulf. And a couple of years ago, after I'd left office, I was in Bahrain at a conference, and the Iranians, out of the blue, announced that Bahrain is their province. And then they sent the Minister of Interior over to the conference to tell everybody this fact. So they might very well decide their response would be not limited at all, but would be a widespread response.
Okay, let's shift a little bit to the Arab Spring. In the last several months, there's been a sea change in politics and policy in North Africa and the Middle East. Secretary Chertoff, has the Arab Spring spawned any new security threats for the United States?
So there's a story Henry Kissinger tells that back in the 70s when he met with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, he said to him, you know, Premier Zhou, looking back now on the Chinese Revolution, which was, you know, some 40 years before, how do you evaluate the Chinese Revolution? And Zhou said, it's too soon to tell. And so then Kissinger said, well, what about the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai said, too soon to tell. So I think that's kind of my reaction to the Arab Spring. We really don't know how this is going to turn out. It certainly upends the established order. You can certainly hope that through a democratic transformation, you'll get rule of law, you'll get increased prosperity, you'll get an elimination of some of the arbitrariness that characterized some of the regimes, and that'll be a positive development. And I guess if you look at Tunisia, people would pick that as a place where it looks like things are developing in a positive way. On the other hand, things could take a turn for the worst. Literally on a day-by-day basis with Egypt, we don't know which way this is headed. Is it going to be better or worse for the people? Is it going to be better or worse for the neighbors? Is it going to be better or worse for us? Clearly, we have a strategic interest in Egypt. I would argue in some ways our biggest strategic interest is Syria. Because in Syria, what we deal with is not only whether this incredibly brutal regime is going to be removed, but we're now seeing a surrogate conflict between Iran, which has been a sponsor of Assad, and Hezbollah, and some of the Gulf states, and Turkey, who are basically supporting the Free Syrian Army. And how this plays out will either empower Iran or be damaging to Iran, and that's going to affect the position of Hezbollah in the region. That's going to affect the security of Israel, the security of Jordan, the security of the Gulf states. So of all the things we've seen in the Middle East, in terms of the, quote, Arab Spring, that which I think is most directly tied to our national security interest is what's going on in Syria.
Cliff, how has the Arab Spring affected America's relations with the countries in and the people of the Middle East?
Well, we're in a sort of limbo at this point where I think we're struggling with what to do in each of these cases. Do we continue to supply aid to Egypt, or do we not supply aid to Egypt? We have in the President Mohammed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who, by the way, would agree with the members of the pro-terrorism community who were so graciously invited here tonight, that 9/11 was an inside job. This is going to be a problem. The military is nothing admirable, but they are going to say you need to continue to support us if you want us to have some sort of rational government in this country. We're going to have to look differently on Tunisia, where things have not been as bad. Libya actually is, for the moment at least, rather promising. We're going to see some real differences between the Muslim brotherhoods of different places, which is not to say that any of them are moderate. Some of them are more pragmatic than others. So I think right now we have this, we're trying to feel our way and figure out what's going on, and I don't think people at the highest levels necessarily know. I think the Secretary is quite right that over time, if you have free elections and if you have other freedoms as well, free speech, freedom of religion, things could go in a good direction. On the other hand, I've been going to Pakistan since the early 1980s. They've had many elections there. It is not going in a good direction. It is going in a very bad direction despite these elections. So I think we're in a very difficult place at this point in this century. We're turning a windy corner of history, as a member of Congress told me some time ago. And I think we're going to have to be very vigilant, and we're going to have to be very watchful, and we have a lot of dangerous times ahead.
Yeah, could I add something? Because I think Cliff brought up Pakistan, which I think is a really important point. You know, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and it has been a democracy, but I would agree with Cliff. I think it's proceeding in a very dangerous direction. What you're seeing is the disempowering of the elected government, which is not by any means a Jeffersonian model, and you know, there's issues of corruption and nepotism and favoritism that are very problematic. But what we're now seeing is various groups in the Pakistani national security establishment proceeding on their own agendas, some of them more pro-American, some of them frankly enabling groups that kill Americans. We're seeing the judiciary not acting the way judges do, the way we expect them to, but getting very politically involved in trying to overturn the government because of a grievance between the Chief Justice and the current president. And where all this could lead is to a fragmented state which is in possession of actual nuclear weapons. And I would have to say, you know, when we talk about Iran, I would consider the situation in Pakistan a close second in terms of things I would keep an eye on with a direct impact on our own security.